Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I know this is going to be a really valuable evening, and I'm not going to talk for long because I also know that you're all very keen to hear from our special guest tonight, Sir Patrick Stewart, who's been such a staunch and loyal patron of Refuge and has campaigned long and hard against domestic violence for so many years. Thank you, Patrick. And Luke and Ryan Hart, who have written such a powerful and moving book, Operation Lighthouse. They highlight the hidden nature of coercive control and the abuse that they experienced through their childhood and beyond, and at the hands of their father, a man who tragically went on to kill Luke and Ryan's mother, Claire, and sister, Charlotte, age 19. Let's give a particularly warm welcome to these two courageous and inspiring people. Now, before we move on to the conversation, I do want to take a few minutes to set the evening in context. Over the 35 years that I've been at Refuge, I've seen many changes. The most sweeping being that abuse is no longer quite the taboo subject it was back in my early days. People are now talking about it. We have seen domestic violence rise up the political agenda. And yes, there is more specialist support available to women and children than before, and for that I am thankful. And yet, violence towards women still remains the biggest threat they will face in the UK today. 1 woman in 4 in the UK will experience domestic abuse in her lifetime. 2 women a week in England and Wales are still killed by their current or former partners. And every week, 3 women will take their own lives to escape domestic abuse. And we must not forget the children who are exposed to domestic abuse. The NSPCC put this figure at 1 in 5. The Children's Commissioner for England and Wales estimates that 825,000 children live in homes where domestic abuse is taking place. Day in, day out, at Refuge, we see the consequences of children who have watched their mothers being beaten. More than half of the residents in our refuges are children, some of whom are so traumatized they can hardly speak. We know that with specialist support, they can and they do overcome the impact of this trauma. Yet it is a sad indictment of our nation's funding priorities that so little support is made available to them. Refuge has urged the government, as the forthcoming domestic violence bill progresses, to give these children the protection they so urgently need and deserve. Today's children are tomorrow's future. So where else do we need to see change? Well, we need to take a long and hard look at the myths, the traditional social attitudes which still persist, the myths that excuse and normalize violence against women, myths buried in the questions so often still asked. Why didn't she just leave? What did she do to provoke him? Why didn't she just do as he asked? Why? Why do we still blame the woman? Why aren't we asking the man, why did you hit her? Why did you think that was okay? What gave you the right? Why? Why aren't we holding these men accountable for their violent and controlling behavior? Until we challenge gender inequality and sexism, until we challenge traditional role models and expectations, until we challenge male privilege and power, and until we all recognize that violence is a choice a man makes, he alone is responsible for it. It is against the law. Until then, we will never change the status quo, and the grim figures I mentioned earlier may well continue to rise. Men do need to be part of an ongoing conversation against domestic violence. Men who understand that it is a gendered crime and that misogyny has no place in today's world. And this is why I'm so particularly pleased that men like Luke and Ryan are here today. Through their book, they do challenge gender inequality. They do challenge the violent and controlling role model of their father. And they do challenge male power and privilege. And the more we have young men like Luke and Ryan speaking out, the more we have men like Sir Patrick Stewart, who is a constant, valued and vocal campaigner for Refuge, and the more we have men like you in this room, the more hopeful I feel that we can challenge the status quo. And we can create a society where women and children will be safe in their own homes. Now, I know you're all eager to hear from our guests, so I will hand over to our chair, Isabel Hardman. Isabel is assistant editor of The Spectator. She's also a hugely energetic and committed fundraiser for Refuge. And we all know what a constant struggle it is for us to keep finding the funds that we need so we can keep our services open, particularly during such prolonged periods of adversity. So, thank you, Isabel, for your amazing support. We really appreciate it. And thank you, and welcome again, to Sir Patrick Stewart, and of course, our newest Refuge champions, Luke and Ryan Hart. Thank you.
I just want to pay tribute to the work of Refuge. It's a fantastic charity and one I have a very keen personal interest in, and it's wonderful to see the influence that you have at government level, but also the work that you do on the ground as well. It's utterly incredible, and it's quite strange because it's not unusual for me to be chairing a panel where I'm the only woman and everyone else is a man, but it's extraordinary actually that this is a panel on domestic abuse and that the main speakers are men campaigning against domestic abuse. Far too often it's seen as being a woman's issue, and it's not a women's issue, not just because a lot of those children in refuges that Sandra mentioned will be boys and they will have grown up with domestic abuse, but also actually because we need men to change society more widely. And I think it's wonderful that you guys are doing this. It's so powerful and will make such a difference to not just women's lives but to the culture more widely that we have in our society. So thank you so much. And we'll start, Patrick, with you. Just tell us a little bit about your childhood and what it was like for you growing up.
Initially, my childhood was idyllic. It was 1940 when I was born in July, and my father was already away at the war. I have a vague recollection of one time some man wearing very rough clothing was there, who must have been my father, and then he went back to the war. My mother was a lovely, sweet-natured, tiny woman, but very timid, very shy, but she loved her children, and so the first 4 to 5 years of my life were beautiful, despite the fact that there was a war going on in Europe. And we were poor. We were not just a bit hard up. We had very, very little. And we lived in what was known in the West Riding of Yorkshire, where I grew up, as the house was known as a one up, one down. We had one room downstairs, and the door from the yard that it fronted onto went straight into the sitting room, which was all there was. And the stairs went upstairs, where there was one more room, and my brother and I slept behind a partition. There was a cellar, however, and that's where our coal was delivered and where our zinc bathtub lived, except for Fridays when it was carried up and put in front of the fire, which I particularly enjoyed. We had no running hot water. We had no stove, no dishwasher, no washing machine. Very little in the way. We have a radio, and that was the source of entertainment. But my childhood until 1946-47 was beautiful. And then this man showed up, and very gradually over the course of the next couple of years, things became less and less pleasant. He was angry, unpredictable, and particularly at weekends, and I only, with time, learned that he must have been a weekend alcoholic. Monday through Friday, he was a hard-working, serious, dedicated person who never missed a day's work and never skived off or anything. But Friday night, the world changed radically for my brother and myself. My eldest brother had already skedaddled, and our home became a place of danger. Strangely, not for my brother and myself.
So you never experienced violence directly, you were
Never.
always a witness.
But we were, and mostly I was there because my brother was 5 years older than me, and so he began to develop a life outside the home, which I only developed as a result of an English teacher who put me in a play, and that was what changed the rest of my life, right up to today. We were intimidated, and we felt to be at risk, even though my father had never raised a hand to one of us. But he did to my mother, and she was the object of his rage and fury and frustration, and terms that I can only use now in retrospect. At the time, I just wanted it to stop. And my brother and I would lie in bed, and I don't recall my brother ever crying, but I cried and would just say, please let it stop, please let it stop, please let it go away. And then as I got a little bit bigger and I learned more about contentious conversations, I became, which I've said for Refuge before, should never happen to children, I became an expert at monitoring fights and knowing exactly the moment when I had to push out the stairway door and go into the room and put my body between my mother's and my father's. That's all I did.
And what would happen when you did that? So your father didn't stop?
He would back off.
He would back off when you came
Yes.
into the room?
Yes. And then occasionally violence would erupt again. It was often quite serious. We had ambulances outside, we had policemen at different times.
And how did the police respond to
That
calls?
was... Even then, I think I understood that this wasn't good enough. I would hear phrases like, well, you must have done something to annoy him. It takes two to make an argument, Mrs. Stewart. These were the phrases of comfort of a kind on one occasion our doctor actually was called for, and he came up because my mother got knocked around badly.
Did you ever talk to your mother about what was happening? Was it difficult?
She always kept telling me how sorry she was and apologizing to me for what I'd seen and experienced. And my love for her was great, and I never ever saw her as the reason for the problems happening. It was always my father who initiated them. She initiated nothing. She just wanted to have a quiet, normal life. She also, I think, was desperately in love with my father and was right to the very end. I became convinced of that before I left home at the age of 17. Because my brother and I, at one point, were prepared to arrange another home for her, that we would take her and we would keep her there. She absolutely refused. There was no question that she would ever leave my father.
When you say to the very end, what was the very end of their relationship?
She died.
She died. So it was her whole life was her being abused by him, her whole
I don't, because I wasn't at home. I left home at 17 and they lived another 20 years. I think the actual violence diminished, but the shouting and the anger and the intimidation and the demeaning of her never stopped.
So she was still being controlled and emotionally
Yes.
abused. What impact has that had on you as a person?
It was shaming. That was my dominant recollection of how I felt. our community was very small, very tight. We all lived very close together. In a yard, there were actually 7 houses that fronted onto this yard. And the walls were thin, and everything that happened in our house was heard everywhere. And so on Monday mornings, and Sunday nights were always the worst. On Monday mornings when I was walking to school, I would go out of my way to try to avoid neighbors' front doors, even their children, because I knew that they knew what had been happening, and I was ashamed and felt disgraced by it. And particularly when I got a bit older and I tried to talk to, well, my headmaster of my school, and he said that it was impossible, that my father was one of the best men that he'd ever known, that he was a delightful and hard-working man who had great war service. And he said, no, you're making it all up. And that was it. There was no help beyond that. My father was interested in my life when I was being successful. When I was made head boy of my school, I was a secondary modern school, don't get any fancy ideas. Grammar school or private school, it was a secondary modern school. Because on the day of the 11 plus exam, I went walking in the hills and didn't sit the exam, which I got into a lot of trouble about. But when I was doing well, my father was always at my side. When I became head boy, he suddenly became chairman of the parent teachers association, and he never had anything to do with it. But he loved, I don't know quite what it was. As I said, he'd been regimental sergeant major in the parachute regiment. He was a superstar, and he came back to being a semi-skilled labourer with nothing else. And he was angry and disappointed and frustrated. And I think all of those things focused on my mother, that somehow it was her fault.
So he controlled and abused her to take his frustrations with.
Yes. She worked in a weaving shed. She did all her life, and she loved that job. I went there once, and I was horrified by what I experienced, the conditions she was working in. But she loved it because she loved the companionship of other women. They were all women working at these looms.
Do you think you've used acting as an escape from? People often say that actors try to escape from reality by moving into another part, by being another person in another galaxy, I suppose. In some sense. Has that been the case for you?
It has exactly been the case for me. When I was 12, my English teacher, Cecil Dormand, who I spoke to on the phone just a few days ago, he's in his 90s, and he was the man who saved me in so many respects. Because when I was 12, he put me in a play with adults. There was a drama group in my school, run by the headmaster and his wife. She was a director, and he played all the leading roles. It could be so easy. And they did one play, it was called The Happiest Days of Your Life. Brilliant comedy set in a boys' private school when a girls' school is evacuated to stay with them. And there was a character called Hopcroft Minor who was 12 years old. And I was cast. I was told, this is what you're doing, Stewart. And from the moment I set foot on the stage, I felt a level of security and safety that I'd never known before. And the primary reason was that I wasn't Patrick Stewart. I was pretending to be Hopcroft Minor, a privileged child from a privileged family in a private school. And my life was transformed, and that became the attraction for me. Apart from being in a drama group, it gave me an authentic reason not to be at home, and particularly when we were doing performances Friday, Saturday, not Sunday, of course, but then I was. In fact, my father used to come and see me perform because he was proud of me. But it was entirely a form of escape, and for some reason which I don't understand, I was good at it. And thanks to him, I got training and coaching, and I mean Cecil, my English teacher, and he was the first man to put a copy of Shakespeare in my hand. He distributed copies of Merchant of Venice around the classroom, and he said, all right, we do Act 4, Scene 1, which is the famous trial scene, and he cast it, Stewart, you're Shylock. And he said, all right, start reading. And of course we all started reading. And he yelled, he would throw things, would say Stewart, never to hurt anybody, but to get our attention. And he would say, no, not to yourselves, you idiots. This is not a poem, it's drama. Read it out loud. Okay, go back to the beginning and read it out loud. And that was the first time I ever spoke Shakespeare. I couldn't understand a word of what I was saying.
I'm so glad you say that. It's an experience shared by many of us. I'll just move on to Luke and Ryan now. You've been nodding throughout a lot of Patrick's account of his experiences. And you're obviously growing up in a different context. We've had a chat before we came in about the things that you saw being quite different to what Patrick saw. Just tell me a little bit about your childhoods and what it was like growing up with your mother and father.
Yeah, so I guess, again, in repeating what Patrick said, the first, 10 years of my life that I can remember were idyllic. So we spent most of my young years living in a rural farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. So we spent our childhood, me, Ryan and Charlotte, running around with animals just away. Again, our father was there, but he was a man that we occasionally bumped into. He wasn't a big part of our life. We sort of raised ourselves like sort of English rural Jungle Book kids in a way. And then we moved to be nearer to a grammar school, and thought I was going to grammar school. That I'm going to. So I'm not trying to compete, so I think you win. And then we moved, so to be nearer to a grammar school, and then we were in a village, and that was the first time our family was really involved in the world. Before that, we had been isolated, and then when we moved into this village, we just noticed our father, because he was on top of us all the time. He was suddenly an angry man that we'd never really known. And our lives, he was never violent, but our lives seemed to be sort of this incessant set of rules and laws that our father created within our home that we could never satisfy, we could never meet. And we were always kind of felt like we were doing something wrong. Like our father was always perpetually angry at everything we did. He never did anything wrong, it was always us. And we just, as children, didn't want to be a burden. So we kind of made ourselves small as we could be, to need as little as possible, to try not to make our lives any worse. And there was never any violence, but our father, the way he would treat us was how he would treat our mother. And the thing that we really struggled with was seeing our mother's soul being eroded. And I think that's the helplessness that we saw as we visibly saw our mother giving up. Like, as we got older and older, we just saw less and less of her. She was just this functional woman in the home that did everything our father demanded. He was she was an unpaid slave to our father. And for us, that built, there was a huge reservoir of anger that we felt so helpless. But we put it on our backs to try and get our mum and our sister out of that environment, because we knew our father couldn't provide, and he was just, the level of control that he had over our mum and sister and us just made our life so small, and the whole world just felt like something else. So then we went to university, we worked hard, we saved up money, and then our story, I suppose, is the fact that we'd managed to get our mum and sister away from the family house. At which point our father turned up to the Spalding swimming pool car park where our mum and sister were with a sawn-off shotgun, and he killed our mum and our 19-year-old sister Charlotte, and then he shot himself. And for us, that moment was such a confusing moment, because we'd never considered our father to be abusive, because we didn't understand how someone could go from no violence to murder, because we'd always thought domestic abuse was about increasing levels of violence. We thought our father's a horribly angry, controlling man, but we were only moving our mother and sister out to help them have a life. We weren't running away for our lives. We just thought our mum and sister need to see the world. But our father had never kind of gone up that ladder of violence, but what he had done is he'd gone up a ladder of control his entire life. And when you see murder as the ultimate act of control, the story makes perfect sense. But when we interpreted domestic abuse as violence, the story made no sense to us at all. And we were totally shocked. But the thing that really struck us was the media response was equally shocked. And in many ways asked entirely the wrong questions and responded entirely the wrong way by, asking people on the street what our father was like, and people were saying he was a good man, he was always caring. he was good at DIY. Like, our father was the man who would go and help people put slates on their roof or whatever. And apparently that was there was a huge moral standing to that, because he killed our mum and sister and was still a good guy. And we don't know how you can be a bad guy, quite frankly, if like putting slates on someone's roof is more morally important than murdering your family. But that's kind of the angle the media put. They would confuse how a good man could kill his family. We knew he wasn't a good man, but we didn't know it was abuse. We just couldn't understand it.
Do you think your mother saw it in the same way, that she saw him as being controlling, but never really used the word abusive? Like someone who, for instance, I often speak to survivors who say, I almost wish I'd been hit, because then it'd be very easy for me to say I've been abused. Whereas if you've been controlled, you think that, I mean, you keep saying there was never any violence, but actually your mother wasn't able, as I've read your account, she wasn't able to spend her own money. She wasn't able to go and buy anything without his permission, which is theft, is abuse. So do you think your mother, Ryan, saw it in those terms?
So we do know that our mother was afraid, I think, of telling us certain aspects of what our father would do. So I think one good example was when we were in the moving van, fleeing from the family home only 5 days before they were killed. Our mum revealed to us that she was married before she met our father, and for 25 years she kept that secret. She didn't feel that she could tell us it.
Is that because he'd made her feel ashamed of that?
I don't know. I don't know if she knew more about what he was capable of doing, and if she felt that she was shielding us. But our father did create, throughout our entire extended family, a sort of a fear of people speaking up. So I think our mother, she might have known more about what her father would do than we might have. But I think also, as Luke said, her space for living was slowly eroded, and any financial dependence, but any financial independence she had was taken away. By having us kids, she wanted to bring us up in a stable household. She couldn't support us on her own salary. Earning potential, any friends or families, all been cut off. And then when they try to leave, they don't know where they can go, or they don't have anywhere to go. I think for our mother, it wasn't really until we had left university and started earning that she felt that she'd done her job. And that was when she started to listen to us more about a future that we could build outside of our father.
So did you try to persuade her to leave then? How did the conversation come about that led to you leaving her and your sister?
Yeah, so I think it's when we started to go to university that Luke and I knew that home wasn't right.
Yeah.
And we'd always believed that that was how men acted and how families were.
So it was your normal, basically?
For us it was normal. And it was when we started to live with other people and realised that living shouldn't be gritty and difficult day in, day out, that we started to, I guess, wish for a better life. But we couldn't provide that until we started earning. So we were talking for quite a few years to our mum and telling her, like, we want to help you. But we didn't really have any means to help her. So it was a conversation ongoing for about 5 or 6 years until we could offer our mum, like, this is our idea and we can actually pay for you to move out somewhere. So it was a conversation which was ongoing. It wasn't until that we had earned enough money to rent somewhere that our mum, I think, could get on board. Because like I said, the option was just run out to the street and just hoping.
And I think the thing for me is that our mother, I think she protected us by focusing us on school. She saw education as our freedom, and she wanted us to, I think she knew she'd been anchored. So one of the key things about our story is, like, our father was, like our mum told us when the moving van, was married when he first met our mother. And the reason he left his previous wife is because she wouldn't have children. And he immediately met our mother, threw away contraceptive pills and said, you're having my child. So our father instinctively knew that he wanted to control a woman, and he knew to control a woman she needs to have children as an anchor and dependency. And then when I was 3, I was rushed to hospital because I'd eaten nuts, and I was told that I had a life-threatening attack, and I was told that that was discovered in that moment. And the reason we moved to that rundown farmhouse was because of that attack, apparently, this is what our father said. And he wanted to move us away so we could grow our own food. We knew what we'd be eating. I'd never suffer an accidental nut allergy attack again. And we believed that. That was the narrative that covered our entire lives. And we had no reason to believe anything different. And it was only after the murders the police investigation revealed that it was already known I had a nut allergy at that point. And my father had fed nuts to me in front of my mother to demonstrate control over my life as a threat. And then he used that as leverage to move our mother into isolation. So actually, to me, in retrospect, our father, dependency through me having a child, he then used isolation to move our mother. Our parents didn't work for 10 years when we lived on this kind of farmhouse. So isolation and then poverty, he basically worked as little as possible, stopped our mother working as much as he could, and then he had the perpetual excuse that we didn't have enough money to go and see friends, we didn't have enough money for fuel to do stuff. We couldn't leave the house, we couldn't even heat the rooms in the house except for the living room, so we had to be within his gaze all the time. So he'd created a system of control that we never even saw because we were born into it. And our mother, I think, was so quickly ratcheted through that she had very little options, so she kept it hidden from us, her pain, so we could escape, I think.
What has been the impact on the two of you of not just the murder of your mother and sister, but also that upbringing where you were so controlled, and the thought of a father giving his child something he knows he's allergic to is really incredibly shocking. I can see that there are people in this room who are very moved by this, and you two are quite used to telling your story, so you are very composed, but the impact must have been huge on you.
Yeah, so I think growing up in that environment, like Luke said, we knew that if we were to give our mum a good life, we had to provide that ourselves. So I think from an early age, we learned to be independent and motivated, but it was motivation through fear, I think. Fear that our mum and our sister would never get to live. So we got our heads down and we worked really hard, and I think we both developed quite a strong independence and determination, which we thought was quite productive, but I think looking back now, elements of that are quite dangerous, and we have to kind of find a middle ground.
How do you mean?
We would work ourselves into the ground almost. We never accepted failure because at home failure wasn't an option, and that kind of carried with us into our school life and sports. And I think I personally couldn't find enjoyment in things because everything was to create this life for Mum and Charlotte. I was a machine to free them, essentially. And so my purpose in life was revolved around them. And I think the murders took away that purpose for me, and I think the hardest thing was finding new purpose. I think for the first year or so, waking up each day was just being alive. I wasn't really living. And it wasn't until we started to work with Refuge and to share our story that we found new purpose. And we found that I think we're getting closer to Mum and Charlotte by giving them a voice. I think that's what our father tried to take, was their voice, and try to silence them. And us speaking out is honouring their lives, I think.
One of the things that I think I've seen expressions of shock around the room during this conversation, and one of the things that is quite shocking, I think, for survivors of domestic abuse is that they sort of come out of the relationship if they're lucky enough, and they'll say, how did I think that was normal? We were talking about this in the green room beforehand, the idea that for you it was when you went to university you realised this was not normal, this is not a traditional upbringing, this is abuse. And for you, Patrick, you actually had a teacher saying, no, that's not happening, sort of denying you your voice. Why is it, we'll start with Patrick and then move on to you two, why is it that society does seem to normalise these, it's not even unhealthy relationships, it's criminal behaviour that goes on throughout someone's childhood, throughout a marriage, that means that a woman, her children don't get a chance just to live.
And I think it's important to understand that, as I originally believed, that the kind of things that were happening in my house were only happening in houses like mine. Because I did know that I had friends who came from households where there was a lot of shouting and rowing and fighting and so forth. But it's not the case. We could hear countless illustrations of this, that domestic abuse is prevalent through all levels of society, all levels of education, of employment, of background, even of faith. And I think it is this reason that has kept it so undercover for so many years. We talked about this when I first met you, Sandra, that it's because it is fundamentally a man's issue, domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a woman's issue. We're the people that have to take care of it and solve it. And if a society believed in the 1940s, when I first experienced this, that if they knew that it was prevalent in all levels of society, it then became even more important that it was kept secret, that it was never spoken about, never talked about at all. The only person who ever talked about it was our next door neighbour, who I mentioned earlier this evening, Lizzie Dixon, who was a weaver, worked with my mother, and when things got really bad, she would occasionally just throw open our door and stand in front of my father. She was an impressive woman, and she would put her forearm in his face and say, "Come on, Alf Stewart, try it on me." And he would back off and walk away and leave the room.
He didn't stop.
But
He didn't stop when she did. After her, he knew he could
oh
keep
yes,
going.
it went on. She
Yeah.
didn't put an end to it.
Yeah.
No. But she would control that moment, and over the years I have so often wished I could take that great hand of hers in mine and thank her for what she did, because whenever Lizzie Dixon turned up, it meant it was going to end. You know? But it is the secret nature of this kind of abuse, that the abused doesn't talk about it. The families of the abused don't talk about it because it's shameful. It's not how other people live. Oh, but it is how so many, thousands and thousands of people live at every level of society. And one of the things that I cheer about with the #MeToo revolution that has been happening in the last 18 months or so is that it is making people review relationships and partnerships that have been thought to be standard behavior when it's not standard behavior, and that applies to domestic violence just as much.
Yeah, I think for me, so domestic abuse is about belief systems and not emotional reactions. I think that's what we learned from my father, was he didn't act that way because he snapped or because he was pushed or provoked. He acted that way because he genuinely believed he was entitled to control our mother and own us, and he believed we were possessions. And I think a lot of that stems from his traditional masculine beliefs that a man is the head of the household. And that's still quite common throughout society. I think it's quite scary for a lot of men, because tackling domestic abuse is also challenging masculinity in a form. And a lot of men have inherited those beliefs from previous generations. And challenging your own beliefs, I think Luke and I are quite open to it, but it's quite a tough topic, I think, to discuss with men. I think that's why a lot of men don't want to talk about it, because it involves them looking into themselves and changing who they are. And we shouldn't be afraid of adapting to society and changing, especially if we've inherited dangerous beliefs from our fathers. Luke and I have actively tried to work to push away anything our father tried to force onto us. He tried to make us in his image. And he got more and more irate as he realised that Luke and I were like our mother and our sister. And we have, especially the last few years, we've started to realise what aspects of us are from our father. We've worked to push them away. And I think it's important for all men to do that, to really look at who they are. Are they just conforming to an easy bundle of masculine identities, or are they becoming who they believe is actually a good man? And I think that is quite scary for a lot of men, I think.
How have men responded to you as you've been campaigning? I mean, we were talking just before we came in of sometimes when I finish doing fundraising runs for Refuge, I've had men saying, "Why weren't you running for the men?" So I think, well, why weren't you running for the men? But what's the response from your friends or from wider society that you are campaigning on a women's issue?
Well, I actually find it, I find it quite fun actually, because domestic abuse to me is a man's issue, just like as Patrick said. We're the ones that perpetrate it, right? In general we are. But the thing that I find really funny is that some men think it is a men's issue, but they think that men are the victims. It's not that at all, right? Like, to me, it feels like there's that classic male domination trait being forced onto victimhood. Like, we don't want to be victims of something that's a woman's issue. If you know, I want to make this a man's issue, right? Otherwise it's girly to be like domestically abused or whatever. But it's not at all. Like, we're here, we've all suffered from it. And why can't men accept a minority part of a victim status? Why do we have to be the massive victim in everything, you know? And I think, unfortunately, at the moment, there's great work going on with Me Too, but there's also this backlash of male victimhood that's coming up with it. And the thing that we found with our father is he believed he was the victim, always believed he was the victim. The immoral world conspired to ruin him because his belief system told him every day he was entitled to control us and our mother in every way possible. And every time we stepped out of it, it was the ultimate act of humiliation. And for that, we deserve to die. And unfortunately, a lot of men think that at the moment, men feel like they're being emasculated and it's the worst thing in the world that could possibly happen. But if men really cared about men, we would tackle male violence, which is what causes men such massive issues. But they're not interested in tackling male violence, they're interested in supporting masculinity as it is forever. If they want to protect men, they dismantle masculinity, but that's the one thing, the only thing I can tell they're protecting. And that's the one thing we need to get rid of. So for me, it's a fun game to get them all in SpaghettiOs and watch them. Twitter's incredible for that. But I do think that we found that, I don't know what it is, if it's ignorance or if it's just like anger or just confusion. But I think like women attacking men is in domestic abuse, it's such a minority occurrence, and often we see, such as the Sally Challen case coming up, when it does happen, it's often after decades of abuse, a woman trying to break free. As we heard, 3 women a week kill themselves from suicide. These are the options women have to take, or they have to fight back. And often, no conflict is 50-50, right? Someone provokes and attacks, and someone has to defend for their life. And when women defend, they need a weapon, they need to protect themselves, and they're terrified of these men. So when women kill men, it's often because the man is an abuser, and he has been for a very long period of time. So, like, men that want domestic abuse to be about them, fine, but it is about you on the other side of the fence. And I think what men need to do is accept accountability. And unfortunately, we're finding there's a group of men that definitely are, but there's a group of men that refuse to accept any accountability. And that is the fundamental problem, I think, with abuse.
What do you think the best way is to try and reach out and spread that culture and try and shift?
I think one key point is recognising that these men who abuse and murder, they're not happy. Like, our father was not happy, and the only way to get to him was through a selfish, like, showing him how he could improve himself by saving us. And I think showing men that by holding this entitlement, by expecting human beings to be objects, you'll never be satisfied. And I think dismantling masculinity will show them they'll be happier by accepting that human beings are human beings. And also, our father demanded so much of us, but also he didn't let us to help support him in quite a contradictory way. If he'd have helped create an equal family, we could have supported him, it would have been easier for him. And I think demanding that control but not knowing how to use it or not being able to use it makes these men's lives harder. And I think we need to show men that ultimately happiness can come out of this. Like, your life will be easier if you learn to just love and share rather than try and own and control.
How did your father react when you both left for university? Because that's the ultimate act of flying the nest, losing that control. Was it very much a gender thing in that the women have to stay but he was happy for you to leave? What was that dichotomy?
I think, so when we left, I think our father was only really ever concerned with our mother, and we were proxy. So, I mean, I was the only one that was intended, and then, like, you were a mistake. That was obvious. No, our father hated Ryan when he was a small baby. Apparently, it was well known in our extended family that even when Ryan was this, like, upside down baby with his arms and legs in the air, our father hated him because he was unnecessary. He was extra work, and our father just wanted an anchor, and I was the anchor. And Charlotte again was born 7 years after me, so she wasn't planned. Really, our father just wanted us to get out, and have our mother stuck still. And anything that we did to get involved or to potentially free our mother was the issue. So when we went away, it was kind of a mixture of we weren't there, but also our father, it was funny because I guess by making us insecure, by always yelling at us and berating us, it made us really, really like nervous and anxious and felt like, you know, an inferiority complex. But then it drove us so hard to succeed that he was always terrified that we would overrule him and like nick his role as patriarch or ruin his poverty by giving Mum and Charlotte money. And I think he felt that, and he was always nervous about it because it's lack of control again. So it was always like an ambivalence, I suppose. But I think he knew that, like, I mean, isolation was disappearing. As we grew older, the dependency was disappearing. And then as we went to university and started to earn money, the poverty was disappearing. So his three mechanisms were slowly falling away. So as we were getting older, he was getting angrier and angrier and angrier because he just didn't know what else he could do. And the only thing he could do in the end was to kill our mum and sister. So it was always getting worse. And I think when we went to university, it didn't really change much, did it?
Now, we do know that when Charlotte went to university, he was not supportive at all of her. He definitely did look down on Mum and Charlotte, I think, because they're women. I think he held extreme views of what men should be and what women should be. And Charlotte didn't enjoy her course. She initially went to do nursing and she wanted to change to primary school teaching. And he berated her and Mum because Charlotte wanted to change. And quite a defining attribute of his was he would remind you of a small mistake you made, or he'd make something a big deal. And he drove Charlotte to depression by just screaming at her about how she'd wasted a year of her life or money. And when Charlotte went to university, I think that's when we became more frightened of what was happening with Mum at home. But we had managed to get Mum a smartphone, so we started to find out more. And I think the more we found out about what was going on, the more anxious we got. And that's when our plan started to really accelerate to get Mum out, because when you're away at university, I mean, I don't know about Luke, but I was quite worried. I came home every weekend, every holiday, because I couldn't stand being away from Mum because I didn't know what was going on. And it did seem to escalate the attacks on Mum and Charlotte. I think when we were at home, we could shield them a little bit and they could shield us. We kind of took our share of his assaults. But then one by one, as we left, and eventually just Mum and Charlotte, and then eventually just Mum at home, Mum was the sole target of his anger. And so I guess it did get worse for them as we started to go away.
I'm quite interested in terms of, you know, your two different generations of men who've gone through that type of behaviour from your father. My experience of men who've been in domestic abuse environments growing up is that they're frightened to talk about it because they're afraid of being tarred with the said brush. There's that notion that if you've grown up as a child in an abusive family, that somehow you are going to become abusers yourselves. And how are you all tackling? Do you find that? Am I just imagining that feeling? Is that something that's real?
Yeah, for me, I suppose. Yeah, I always heard that, and I guess I think two things get conflated. I think we assume that trauma makes people abuse. But like in an environment where you've witnessed abuse, you've witnessed trauma, but you've experienced trauma, but also you've witnessed the beliefs being enacted that you dominate, a man dominates a woman, whatever. And I don't think it's the trauma that people inherit that makes them abuse. I think it's the belief system they take away that makes them abuse. Because to me, no matter how traumatized you are, it doesn't matter how traumatized you are at all, unless you think it's okay to hurt someone, you won't. And it's the belief that people inherit. And the trauma is kind of incidental, it's just there as well. Because if you think about it, I mean, women suffer this trauma far worse than men. They don't kill for the same reasons, they don't go on and perpetrate, right? And if it was trauma-based, then we'd expect women to be little piles of men everywhere, but there's not.
No, I ask because my brothers are also very kind men in their 40s who've gone through very similar experiences, and they never would hurt someone.
I think we were quite lucky to have grown up with Mum and Charlotte. They showed us that even in a situation of great suffering, you can still choose to love. And I think having them as role models, I think that's one key point, is we don't believe you need a male role model. I think it's good to have one in a family. If you've got a great family, then fine, but you can have female role models as a boy. And our mum and our sister were fantastic role models for us. They showed us love and compassion, and I think that's all you need to be shown. Like, our father tried to show us power and control, and we pushed that back. I think you just need a role model to show you how to be a good human being.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what saved us, was having Mum and Charlotte in our life.
I wonder, what role do you think education, and I mean from the very beginning, from preschool and nursery school and so forth, what role can that play in a child's development and well-being when it becomes suspected that it maybe it is living in an abusive domestic environment? I think this is one area where the state has let people down badly. Teachers are overworked, underpaid, stressed to perform to certain standards, and so often it seems to me not to simply do a great deal of what goes with the role, which is a caring role as well. And did you have any? Did you ever discuss with any of your teachers what your lives were like? Because children cannot hide successfully what's happening to them, whether it's not eating or self-harming. It's present. Did you ever feel any connection with the people at your school?
I suppose for the other thing, yeah, so one of the things that caught us out is we had this model of violence for abuse, domestic abuse again, and we thought that kids that grew up in domestic abuse were very snappy, they reacted with anger, they're very emotionally unrestrained, and they responded very quickly to emotional triggers. But we didn't. We were very quiet, diligent, we always obeyed rules, like we never stepped outside of boundaries. And that was because our life was so controlled, like we'd learned not to. And actually I suppose that might be a difference between violence and coercion and control, like they maybe force people into different behaviours, but we were like the perfect students. Like I said, we were very driven, we realised the responsibility on our shoulders from mum and sister. We learned never to step outside of boundaries, so we looked like the perfect students. No one ever raised a question, right? Like they're quiet, they're doing their work on time, they never, Ryan I don't think put his hand up in like 10 years. So we just never stuck out. But actually I think it's important to realise, like if you look at women that have been abused, that's what they look like. It's very quiet, very super obedient, almost slavish because they've been trained into it. And I suppose we'd been trained into that model. And I think with boys, we particularly think that boys become angry and fighty and women become controlled and quiet. But actually, gendered approach is kind of, well, we all can encompass those different responses. And I think it's understanding there's a whole range of responses to abuse, because it was never picked up on us, unfortunately.
I just want to say to all three of you that I've sat here tonight and I've listened to everything that you've all said. You've brought tears to my eyes. I just want to say that you are absolutely bloody amazing. And I have so much respect for you, and you should be so proud of yourself, because of everything that's been bad and negative that's happened to you in your life, you still want to do good out of it. So well done. That's all I wanted to say.
I don't think I could compete with that note on which to round up. It is fantastic and just so powerful to hear from all three of you, and to see that you really want to fight to end domestic abuse. And there will be so many women in this room and across the country who are so grateful for what you're doing, because it will save lives, and it will mean that women can live as well, and live a life that they want to live as well. So thank you.
A few final things from me, and just to start by saying a big round of applause also for Isabel, who's been a fantastic chair. So everyone in the room here today is a fantastic Refuge supporter and champion, and for which we are all hugely grateful. As you all know, we run loads of services, and are right now, as I've just seen the dashboard tonight, supporting 6,831 women and children, which I think is amazing. Women like Mrs. Stewart, like Charlotte, like Claire, like Holly, and so many others. And we really couldn't do that work without all of you. It is wonderful to see so many very long-standing supporters in the room with us tonight. You all as individuals or in your own roles within your organisations help us enormously. And as Sandra mentioned in her words, we are partway through a very important part of the calendar called 16 Days of Action. 16 Days of Action launched on Sunday and it runs until 16 days' time, the 10th of December, where there is a global movement to raise awareness of violence against women and girls and create understanding and share information and take positive action. We have our own very exciting campaign to do just that, as I mentioned earlier, called Refuge Sheroes. And really this is a call out to each and every one of you as our amazing supporters to please find out more about our campaign. There's a flyer in some goodie bags that we're going to give you when you leave tonight, and to ask you to sign up to become one of our Refuge Sheroes, and to then be able to share and amplify what you're doing, hopefully on social media. We have some lovely little design Shero, I'm a Shero supporter, I'm a Refuge Shero, signs for you to hold up that we would love you to have photos of tonight, take on your phones, and we've taken the liberty of crafting a little tweet that you could all issue on our behalf once you've signed up, and share those far and wide, because what we want to do in our own little way, much like the Me Too movement that Sir Patrick referenced earlier and rightly so, is to create a large group of individuals who support this issue, and from here keep growing it and growing it. And this is our first foray into really taking such a stance in a digital kind of format, and anything you can do to help us get that out there would be absolutely amazing. So I have nothing further to say other than to thank all of our speakers, including Sandra, and to ask that you are able to stay around for a drink and a nibble and catch up with friends old and new who are here today and find out more about what we all do. So thank you very much.